Hello and welcome to the Books Uncovered podcast, a brand new podcast from Fulcrum Publishing, where we explore the world of books and the people who make up the publishing industry. I'm Sam Shinta, publisher of Fulcrum Publishing, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kateri Kramer, who's Fulcrum's marketing director. Hi, Kateri, how you doing today?
Hi, Sam. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are things out in Colorado?
They're really good. Yeah. Warm as usual, but everything is dry in the high country, which is wonderful. And we're getting a lot of afternoon rain, which is also pretty nice.
Oh, I bet you need the moisture. Have you gotten out fishing lately?
Not since we last talked, but I've been on my bike a lot and up in the Alpine quite a bit. So that's kind of made the lack of fishing okay.
Okay, well, as long as you're out somewhere doing something
Yeah.
fun, I guess that counts a lot.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, excellent. Well, I'm really excited about our guest today because our guest today is not only one of my favorite book people, but one of my favorite people, full stop. And so it's just a real honor to have her on today. Our guest today is Kate Thompson. Kate Thompson has nearly 30 years experience in book publishing. She worked in editorial positions in Minnesota, Maine, and Massachusetts, the three M's, before returning to her home state in 1999, her home state of Wisconsin. At the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, she held the roles of managing editor and editor-in-chief before becoming the press director in 2018. There, she acquires manuscripts and leads the press team in publishing books on Wisconsin history and culture for all ages. She lives in Middleton, Wisconsin with her husband and can often be found watering her garden, listening to Wilco, or rereading everything Stephen King has written. Welcome, Kate Thompson. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. So my first question, why Stephen King?
Why Stephen King? Well, see, I think that you and I may have bonded over Stephen King back when we first got to know each other. So I think you
Absolutely.
know, as I do, I think he's one of the great American writers. Especially love his ability to create characters. I think my favorites of his characters are young people. He writes, nobody writes a 12-year-old boy like Stephen King does. And there's something very cinematic about his writing. And I think I would feel that even if so many of his works hadn't been turned into movies, many of them very bad movies, but there's a visual aspect to his writing that really draws you in and makes you feel like you're one of the characters.
Absolutely. You are absolutely right that, I mean, this was a softball question because I knew the answer, that we did bond over Stephen King many, many years ago. I would argue, and I don't know if this is a hot take anymore. I think maybe 10 years ago or so when he got that National Book Award commendation, and it seemed to create some controversy in the industry. It maybe was a hotter take, but I think in my lifetime as a 50-something, he's been the most important writer in my lifetime. And he's somebody who's meant something to me when I was younger, when I was in, kind of my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, I just continue to grow with him and reread him. And he's just been so very meaningful in that respect. I also think subtly, I made a comment one time and someone pushed back, but I said, I think he's kind of like our Dickens in that he's incredibly prolific, but he's also writing and often subtly about the social ills of the time. Mm-hmm. They're very much grounded in what's going on, not explicitly, but you can kind of get that undertone of what really is happening in America through a lot of his books. And they're so pointless, they're so detailed that you really just can drill down on certain things as well. So yeah, share that passion. So excellent.
I'm rereading The Talisman. It's a great summer book to read, I think, and that's the one that he co-wrote with Peter Straub in the 80s. I believe it's an early 80s publication. So there's a recommendation for listeners and watchers. It's just so good. And one more thing about this, and I know we have other things to get to, but I think there's a warmth in his writing that I really respond to.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
I think, you know what I mean? He loves his characters, and you feel that, and even most evil of the evildoers in some of his, some of his works, but he has a real compassion for his characters, and I think for us as readers, that has just always come through for me.
Well, and the fun thing about the Talisman, for me at least now, is that the sequel, Black House, is set in French's Landing, Wisconsin, which is La Crosse, Wisconsin. And so it was just so fun to pick up a novel by this great writer that's, I can recognize the streets and the docks and the restaurants and everything that he is describing. It's just right there. So it's always fun to have that sense of place too. And I think he does a terrific sense of place as well in so many of his books.
Agreed.
Well, we could probably do an hour-long podcast just on Stephen King, but let's move on to some other things. So you've been in publishing for some time. How did you break into the industry?
Sure. So while I was an undergrad at UW Eau Claire, took a lot of English classes, took a lot of journalism classes, and by senior year took a publishing class that just kind of made sense. It sort of brought together all of those interests, and I think that's where I learned, well, that's a field I could actually get into and not just be, sort of receiving books, a more passive experience, of being a book lover as a child and a young adult, but I could actually make books. So from there, applied all over the Twin Cities and region when I was ready to graduate, and got my first publishing job in 1990 with Voyager Press, which at that time was based in Stillwater, and was, I believe I was employee number 8. So we were small and independent, and I learned everything. I had an editorial assistant kind of position, but I wrote marketing copy, and I this is before even desktop publishing was a thing for publishers. So we were sending out type and having it come in galleys and laying out books on boards and going down to the dark room and making screen prints for the illustrations that were going to be in the books, and then laying all of that out by hand. So I learned all of that, and I rode that transition through desktop publishing, helped Voyager get up and running in PageMaker, which was the program of the time for all of us who were getting our start in that. And again, being able to try my hand at every role really in a press was an incredibly lucky way to start for me. From there, I moved around a bit. I came down to Madison and had a job at the University of Wisconsin Press in the production department, and then saw a ad in the back of Publishers Weekly, like we all used to do, print edition, for a job in Maine for an imprint of McGraw-Hill, and applied for that, got that job, moved out to Maine, spent a couple years doing that on the coast of Maine, working on books about sailing and outdoor recreation and things that you would want to be doing on the coast of Maine. Got a position then from there with Story Publishing in Massachusetts. That is before they were bought by Workman, so another independent press, and kind of a small size press where, again, I was able to do a lot of different things. Had a managing editor role there, worked on some recipe projects that sort of, I think, cemented for me my love of projects that have to do with food and foodways and cooking. And then came back home to Wisconsin and did some work for a typesetter. So I got to work on that side of the industry and learn the detailed work of typesetting and managing typesetting projects for customers, presses. And so got to work with folks like Columbia and presses like that. And then a position opened here at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and I started here in 2000. So I've been here an astoundingly long time to me, and am really very proud to have been part of building this press as it is today, which is to say, with the reputation and presence that we have in the region as a very high quality regional trade publisher, a little less academic than the Historical Society Press has been at other times in its very long existence. This press has been in existence since 1855. But really it has become a regional trade press in about the last 20 years.
Yeah, I love that overview because you really capture so much of the publishing industry's history, but what has also changed so much, right? That this whole idea that you started when computers were just on the horizon, and now everything is online. You started at the time when, you know, there was still a tactile part of the making a book process, to now, again, everything's happening in the cloud and virtually. And what has been to you the biggest change that you have seen over the course of your career?
I think it's exactly what you just described. The memories that I have of that first job really are very physical. You know, the smells of the chemicals in the darkroom, the hot wax machine that you fed type through in order to make the back sticky so that you could put it on boards, and how you would burn your fingers on that wax machine every time you used it. The smell of the blue line proofs.
Oh yeah,
right?
love that.
We
Yep.
called those Oslids when I worked at Voyager Press, and I have no idea. I think that's a British term for it. But in those early days, we did much of our printing, especially of 4-color, in Hong Kong. And so the Hong Kong printers would send us what we called Oslids, and it was, you know, sort of your last proof before print, or before, you know, like an F and G that you would see, a folded and gathered signature set of proofs. And they had the oddest chemical smell that I don't think I've ever smelled, you know, since.
It's
So-
kind of like the old the old mimeograph, or the copier things back in elementary school, when you'd hold them up and smell them when you got them, they were all wet right away. Yeah, it was just an odd smell, but a fun smell, funky, fun smell.
Right. And that, I mean, of course, there's still the smell of a book that you just crack open, right, when it comes from the printer. That hasn't changed. But, you know, we're talking about these changes that are sort of about the physical work, but of course the way that those changes play out in our day-to-day is what's so different, and the way we work together as a team is so different. And the pandemic that we've lived through has only made that more of a distinction. You know, the way we work, you talked about everything in the cloud, we're proofing on Adobe, and we're not meeting in person very much. You know, we do here at the Historical Society, we all have somewhat of a hybrid schedule now, and are in the office some days and not in the office other days. Luckily, much of what we do can be done at home, you know, as long as you've got a decent Wi-Fi connection, you know, you're able to collaborate and do the basic steps in a publication process. And you have the benefit, I think, of some really deep work time where you're able to edit or write copy, or, you know, do those things that are best done uninterrupted. But of course, we miss, you know, being together, and the synergies that happen in the doorways and the, you know, the hallways and those things. So I'm not sure it's all for the better that we are working so virtually and so in the cloud. We've made it work. We've created a lot of workarounds. And there are some great things about it. We've been able to do some great professional development, conference attendance and things like that, share with peers that we wouldn't have said we had the budget for in the past because of travel expenses. So I don't think we know. I think the jury is out on whether you know, things are better this way and we're getting more done, or you know, feeling as productive, because there's pluses and minuses to all of the constraints that the pandemic have created for us.
Yeah, totally. I think we're finding kind of the same thing, where it's like there's some really great positives, like being able to get into this super deep work and not have somebody like walk in your office or have a phone call or something like that. But then you miss out on like being able to walk over to somebody's office and be like, hey, what do you think about this? So yeah, I completely agree that the jury is still out, and it'll be interesting to see how things evolve as as the years go on. I have a question about what some of your favorite book projects that you've worked on are through the years. Could you like talk about maybe 2 or 3 that you've just thought were really cool or really fun to work on?
Yes, I could probably talk about 200 or 300, but
Okay.
yeah, sure.
Who are your favorite children, Kate?
Yeah, right. And who are the ones I really don't care
Right.
for?
Yeah.
Sure. So many, but yes, a couple. One that comes to mind because we just released it in a paperback edition, but it's a book we did about, maybe 2008 or so. That is a memoir of a Menominee man, and the title is Little Hawk and the Lone Wolf. And the author's name is Raymond Kakatosh. And this is a memoir that he had written maybe 2 decades earlier and never done anything with. And by the time he came to us, on the advice of someone who met him at the veterans retirement home where he was living at the time, he was in his, I think, maybe late 80s or had even turned 90 by the time he came to us and said, someone suggested I reach out to you. And he had this this memoir of his life story, his experience. He was born in the 20s. He was born on the Menominee Reservation. So he grew up on the res. He went to boarding school, the Indian boarding schools that you hear about and that we all know to have been a tragic part of the nation's history. But for Ray, having grown up in such poverty and in an overcrowded home, and he found, he had a warm bed and he had food and he had things that he didn't have. Not to say it's a sentimental look at that, but it's a first person account of that. And he could see and relay the good things and the negative things about that experience. From there, he goes on to college and to serve in the military. And as I said, it's his life story. The challenge was finding a narrative arc, helping him shape it into a story that, would resonate with a wide audience of readers, share a story that maybe a lot of folks hadn't read or heard, about their neighbor, one of their neighbors here in the state. And there were layers and layers of challenges too in working with, someone who was living in a retirement home, didn't really have, he couldn't come and go freely, he didn't drive and he couldn't, we couldn't meet easily. Even the phone was a challenge, technology, major challenge, but it's a beautiful book. It's a really, really great story. I see it as a really important contribution to the stories of the people of the state, but it's also a great read. So that's definitely one of my favorites. What else? I mentioned my interest in food and recipes and cooking. The Society Press has long had a book in print called The Flavor of Wisconsin, originally published in the 80s. And at that time, it was a it's a huge book. The first half is sort of Wisconsin food history from the beginning to the 80s to the today of the time that the book came out. And then the second half is all recipes, which were solicited through women's auxiliary groups and that kind of thing of the day. And then about 15 years ago, we produced a revised edition of that book where we added, first of all, recipes from more recent immigrant groups and new arrivals in the state. So we went beyond what you would expect to find in that original book, the Norwegian recipes and the German recipes, and there may have been a couple of Native American recipes and maybe a Hispanic recipe. So we took the time to solicit and seek a much broader range of recipes to tell that sort of ethnic story of the state through food, and brought the text up to date as well. So that's wonderful. Also, there's a recipe for a whole beaver in that book. So, we've got some really.
Where would one acquire a beaver?
Well, in the Northwoods. old recipes and some new recipes. So that's a favorite. One of my first projects when I walked in the door here in 2000 was to pick up a project that had been acquired, and the author was working away on writing according to the terms of her contract, and the vision was a fairly academic 6x9, one color kind of book. And I had the opportunity to share, what I had brought from working in the kind of publishing I described at the start here, that I'd been doing heavily illustrated books for color work, this kind of thing. And it was Patty Lowe's Indian Nations of Wisconsin. And I got to work with Patty as her editor and shape that book into the larger trim size for color, lots of images. And it is now in its second edition. It's always at the top of our best-selling titles lists every year, and will continue to be so, I think, because it filled such a huge gap on the history bookshelf, really, the Wisconsin history bookshelf, to tell the really sort of concise but authoritative histories of all the Native nations in the state.
Yeah.
That book, I recall recently, I think it was NPR did the list of the books you should read for every state.
Yeah.
And that book was listed for Wisconsin, and then coincidentally, our Indians of the Pacific Northwest by Vine Deloria Jr. was the book for the state of Washington.
Right.
And so it's just wonderful to be able to tell these untold stories, and then for people to actually recognize that independent publishers are doing this sort of heavy lifting and hard work to bring those stories out to the public.
I think that's particularly important because I work with a large number of MFA students who are like just finishing their MFA and then are in that process of like, I have this manuscript, where do I go with it? And I think a lot of programs are telling students to shoot for getting an agent or going to Penguin Random House or something like that. And if you could like tell an MFA student who has this really great manuscript, like why they should want to work with smaller independent publishers, what would you tell them?
Lots of things. I would tell them they will have a much more collaborative experience with their editor, but also as part of the full process of making a book. I think independent presses and smaller presses are much more likely to share cover design options, collaborate with the author on image selection, even type design. I mean, sometimes we're showing authors, especially if it's a more complex kind of book with more parts and sidebars and things, we're showing them sample layouts. We are small but scrappy here at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and we're very hands-on. I would sell that to your MFA friends as a plus and hope that they see it that way. But our editors really roll up their sleeves. We do real editing here. We're not acquiring and then handing it off to, say, a freelance copy editor, where there is a very lengthy phase of developmental edit that happens. And thinking of the kind of books we do with history, of course, there's fact checking, there's external expert reads. We've been doing more sort of cultural sensitivity reads, things like that for certain kinds of projects. So very hands-on all along the way. And then, as I said, looping them in and sharing, not necessarily giving them final decision-making power, but to the degree that we can, it helps everyone if the author is happy and loves the cover and the design and all of the, the elements of the craft of making the book. So I think I'm positive there are great hands-on editors at Penguin and at Simon & Schuster. And I don't mean to say that, that there aren't or that they don't care, but I think even with our limited resources and capacity, we make it a priority to maintain our author relationships. Mm-hmm. We swim in a small pool and people come back, people resubmit, people tell their friends, and it's just all to the good if we can have them come out of the process of working with us in a positive place and as an ambassador really for our press.
Yeah, that's very cool. Sam, I'm curious what you would say as well.
I would basically echo everything Kate just said. I mean, this is we talk about this all the time as to this is the advantage of working with a Fulcrum or a WHS as opposed to working with a big publisher. Authors know who I am. I mean, they can talk, they can email me, the publisher, directly, and I will respond to them. I will oftentimes at 10 o'clock at night, we're trading emails, right? But you have those personal relationships that matter. And we then end up with a lot of repeat authors or a lot of authors who've worked with bigger presses, but that want a different level of experience and interaction and want to really work with an editor, not just get edited, but really work in that process with an editor. And Kate, you'd mentioned before a couple of the projects you talked about that collaborative aspect. But how, and I know this is a big question that could take a long time, but I'm just kind of curious as a kind of nice little succinct answer to this big question. How do you go about working with an author, right, where their ego is obviously involved, but you somehow have to convince them that collaboration is the key, that it's while they have these great ideas, you might have to shape the project into something different to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about that?
Right. So, of course, there's a spectrum, right, of the things that we acquire being practically ready to go and in great shape to needing a major take apart, put back together, kind of start over.
Mhm.
But the basic bones are there, or the project is so important to our mission that it needs to happen. So the answer to the question then falls right somewhere in there.
Sure.
But let's talk about the big challenges, right? The big editorial challenges. I mean, the first thing to do is to have that conversation before you sign the contract, so that obviously you can only anticipate so much about what you would intend to change and revise and maybe rewrite or ask for more. But you have some idea, and it's essential to have a conversation with that author before contract to say, are you open to this? Here's what we're thinking. Here's a way this would make it a better fit for us. I mentioned cultural sensitivity reads and external expert reads and things like that. We may know quite early that needs to happen if the author hasn't done anything like that yet on his or her own. So we may say, can we help you by facilitating that conversation with, whether it's a historian in a certain realm of history or some other kind of expert to weigh in and comment. And then we've got a round of work to incorporate those comments. So knowing that the author is there with you in it and open to that and understands that that's what's going to be happening, obviously that's fundamental, because you don't want them to be surprised. It's all about managing expectations. So once we've all agreed that yes, this is for the best, to make the best book possible, then I would say, again, for those books that are the big challenge editorially, my process tends to be obviously reading. I'm going to read it maybe twice. I'm going to think about what it needs and all of the kinds of things we just talked about, but even just a structural overhaul, what can just go, what is missing, what's a better order, is there a part structure that would serve this book better, etc. And present that to the author as a plan. Not actually taking the manuscript and doing those things yet, but saying, here's what I propose to do. What do you think? And there's probably some negotiating in there. But then once we have a vision and usually needs an outline, because you need something concrete to look at. If the author agrees to that, then I will go ahead and make it so and restructure in the way we've agreed, without trying to capture all of that in track changes in some way, or it's just, we're talking about things that you can't do in red line because it's completely overwhelming to look at.
Sure.
So take it apart, put it back together according to this vision and plan. And then maybe here's where you're also adding a voice or, engaging, especially when we do books that are about historically underrepresented or marginalized groups, people. We want to be sure those people are part of the process in some way, whether it's a read or adding an introductory piece, or on a children's book that we're working on, we're inviting someone from the Ho-Chunk Nation to write an introduction to each of the chapters to sort of frame the history through that lens. So all of that stuff is happening. And for us here, that can take a year, 2 years even sometimes, of course, depending on many things. But so it's getting the buy-in, agreeing on a vision, setting it out in a clear way so expectations are understood, doing it, rebuilding. And then from there, you can do your sort of line edit where you're actually tracking and showing more of the fundamental changes.
Yeah, it's communication and collaboration, right? It's and just being honest, I think, is the other part of it. I think this is where I've seen so many books have problems, is where you've kind of papered over some of the problems and just we don't want to hurt the author's feelings, or we don't, and actually authors want the best book possible, right? They want you to work with them to bring out those great ideas and the best voice and the best story that can possibly be told.
Right. And as a mission organization, I mentioned that a minute ago, I mean, that's part of it for us too. And in a sense, maybe that makes us a little different, though. I mean, every corporation has a mission, but here we have to be having that conversation early as well with the author. How does this, it's not just about putting something in the world as a revenue stream. It's about putting something in the world that supports the work of the Wisconsin Historical Society, and it advances it and shares our scholarship and the work that we do here in some way, supports the work we do here in some way, and aligns with the brand and the mission and the voice of the agency to a point. That threading that needle about voice is tricky because it's the author's voice that reigns supreme in this work, and we work very hard to let their voice stand and let them have a point of view, even of course, right? Even though we're this mission organization, the reason we work with a given author is because they have a point of view, they have something to say, they may be making some kind of argument, right, in the academic sense, and we want that to shine through. So sometimes they get in their own way a bit, and that's another one of the tricks, right, is to kind of do the sifting and winnowing that editors do and help an author, maybe not spend 4 chapters on the background of the historical event that they're sharing, but kind of get there quicker. Like there's a thing in this field where often authors, I think it's hard for them to part with the research they've done and the facts that they've found, the fruit of their research labors. And so it's the editor's job to help them see what you do need to keep for context and what you don't have to do because it's been done in 14 other books. And this is, maybe a line or two helps you provide that context that's needed, but you don't need to tell the entire, regimental history, for example, before you get to the big battle.
Yeah, but sometimes, as Faulkner said, it means killing your darlings, right? So well, on the subject of craft, this brings me to my favorite part of every episode, which is, hey, what you reading? Where we talk with our guests about books that they would recommend. And the topic we picked this week, given our guest, is your recommended book about the craft of writing.
Yeah.
Or book craft.
Right.
So what did you have?
Well, so I'm recommending the book How to Write One Song. by Jeff Tweedy, who is the lead singer of Wilco. I hope you all know that. And it's a charming, accessible, delightful little book. It's maybe 160 pages. And if you've ever been to a Wilco show or followed Jeff Tweedy in any way, he's just a guy. He's just a guy from Southern Illinois who, sort of is incredibly creative and now found himself leading, one of the best bands ever. And yet he's very humble. And, I mentioned this idea of sort of the warmth that I feel from, my friend Stephen King, but I feel that from Jeff Tweedy in this book too. He just recognizes that he's been doing this a long time and he has some ideas. And so I should say, yes, it's called How to Write One Song, but it's definitely, applicable to writing more generally. And, he's trying to explain something that seems sort of unexplainable, right? The magic of writing and poetry, and in the case of song lyrics, but writing more broadly. And he just is really sincere, I think, in his desire to share his experiences, some tips that he offers, but also recognizes there are other tips. But I think the guiding principles he shares are, make writing a habit, which of course we've all heard 1,000 times, but put your ego aside, make writing a habit, because as he says, inspiration is overrated. It's really about process. It's really about getting out of your own way and just letting try some tools, try some games, try free writing, mind mapping, all of these things, 6-word stories, stuff like this, to do this every day as a process. And he's not saying, and it will come and it will all be, wonderful, but he has some great, brings a lot of great humor to this and really does help you sort of set your ego aside, I think.
Excellent recommendation. How about you, Kateri?
I chose two because I couldn't just choose one. My first one is probably the craft book that I revisit most frequently, and it is called The Shell Game: Writers Play with Borrowed Forms. It's edited by Kim Adrian. And it's like part craft, but also part collection of these hermit crab essays, which is basically just an essay that fits into a different form. So some of them are in the form of a crossword puzzle. Some of them are in the form of a medical chart or a grocery list. And it's this practice of taking something other than the writing and putting the content into that. And I really love that. And I go back to it all the time. So that's my first one. My second one is by the great Philip Lopate, To Show and to Tell. This was maybe my first book that I came to when I started my own essay writing process. And I think it's like the best primer for essayists. It's that very Montaigne style essay of thinking on the page and not knowing the answer until you get to the end of the essay, and maybe even then not knowing, but learning. And there's the whole first section, which is these practices that you can go to. And it's the personal essay in the time of Facebook and how to research and using truth and that kind of thing. And then the second part is taking those tools and looking at really good essays. And he uses people like Lamb and Hazlitt and stuff like that. So it's really cool that there's this gap between like modern day techniques and then the original essayists. So yeah, I think those are my two most favorite craft books.
Well, I also cheated because I was afraid Kate might pick one of mine because of our shared favorite author, which is Stephen King's On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft, which she had there too. So yes, so we both will have done that one. And my other one though, and it's a very similar book. It's Draft Number 4 by John McPhee on the writing process. And what I love about both these books is they're effectively memoirs of writers that in the process of telling their own stories of being a writer and playing with various forms and techniques, they then distill lessons for people who want to write. And so they're highly readable, and it's, you don't feel like you're just reading a craft book. You feel like you're reading something that just pulls you into a life story. Stephen King's especially, I mean, he walks through all the tough times, which again, if you're an MFA student, right, read that book and read about how he's writing for, trashy pulp magazines and getting rejected and rejected and rejected over and over again. And it's that persistence that you just see, and knowing that, well, I have a story to tell, even if people are not recognizing I have something to tell and I have something to share, in that persistence. And then McPhee, I mean, just the way he's able to take apart and pick apart an essay, and why he made certain word choices or framing choices or setting choices is just terrific. And so I revisit both of them. Draft number 4 is a newer title, but I revisit both of them frequently. Well, this has been a lot of fun, Kate. I really, really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much for talking so much about the craft of the books, the book world, and the craft of editing, and what it means to be a mission-driven publisher, and what it means to love someone like Stephen King. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's really good to be with you.